What's up guys, my name is Graham and I run this YouTube channel where I like to talk about anything in the games industry which happens to catch my eye. Today I'm talking about re-released games, and once again I start with a simple question. Didn't we used to hate them? Let's go on a journey back to the heady days of the early to mid 2010s. The youth, by which I mean me, were obsessed with who was giving who love on Bebo, and there were emo fringes, so many emo fringes. I'm not gonna lie, I haven't actually changed that much since back then, and I don't give a shit. But those were not the only trends developing around that time. In the games industry, we were seeing an increased amount of re-released games, by which I mean remasters or remakes, re-releases, reboots of games that had come out on previous consoles. And we were not fucking happy about it. Not one bit. From my research, it seems like this trend initially started in earnest around about 2009 when we got God of War HD Collection, Volumes 1 and 2 of course, but it really hit a fever pitch around 2011-2012, which brought us Echo and Shadow of Colossus Collection, Metal Gear Solid HD Collection, DMC HD Collection, Jak and Daxter Collection, Okami HD, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Trilogy, Ratchet and Clank Collection, Silent Hill HD Collection, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD Collection, DuckTales Remastered, Final Fantasy X and X-2 HD Remastered. And those were just the more prominent ones that I picked off a Wikipedia list. The end result of this was that by around 2015-ish, both gamers and industry commentators had become thoroughly fed up with re-released games. Without too much effort, I found various articles from around the time bemoaning the whole situation, such as this one from Wired titled "Over Game Delays and Remakes? Welcome to consoles in 2015. This complains about the lack of new games coming out around the time, along with the increasing amount of remasters, re-releases and sequels that we were seeing. Fast forward to now, however, and some of people's most anticipated games are re-releases of old games. At the time of recording, the GTA Remastered trilogy just got announced to great fanfare. People are excited over rumours about Metal Gear Solid remakes potentially in the works, and games in the Silent Hill franchise, although it's not clear just yet whether they're going to be actual remakes or whether they might be more reboots which change the originals. On top of that, people have been clamouring for ages for a remastered version of Bloodborne, which runs at 60 FPS and performs well generally in 4K. And it's not just all about future releases either. There's plenty of examples of games that have come out recently that were re-releases that have done particularly well. That is both in terms of sales and just general perception. You've got Final Fantasy VII Remake, 2 Resident Evil remakes, a Spyro trilogy, a Crash Bandicoot trilogy, and Demon's Souls. And yet now, in 2021, I'm not seeing any of those articles that complain about the increasing number of re-releases and the lack of originality in games. And to be honest, I'm not even feeling just more broadly the general sort of disgruntled atmosphere that the industry had back in 2015. So, what changed? Well, I don't think this was the main reason for a lot of the frustration back then, but it might have certainly contributed. I think there was some anger spilling over from the film industry back in 2015, which at the time was churning out a seemingly endless fucking conveyor belt of just terrible reboot after terrible reboot. Gems such as RoboCop and, dare I say it, Total fucking Recall. I think the main factor that caused a lot of this uproar is that a lot of these re-releases were HD collections that were sort of low effort remasters of games, some of which had only come out, as little as maybe 5 years prior or less. This was combined with the fact that console manufacturers at the time were increasingly moving away from any sort of inbuilt backwards compatibility in their machines, which made a lot of these HD collections feel like pretty greedy, lazy, low effort cash grabs. Basically, it was like companies were now sort of charging for something that we essentially got with the price of a console purchase before, and I think that's what led to a lot of the unhappiness. On the other hand, however, a lot of these games that we're seeing today would be better described as actual remakes than remasters. There's more work put into them. In some cases, the games are even being completely rebuilt from the ground up and totally modernised. And looking back at the timeline, I think there was one or two games in particular that started us towards this new trend, this new, more acceptable trend, and got us off the track of lazy HD collections. And that is 2018's Shadow of the Colossus remake by Bluepoint Games. Bluepoint remade this PlayStation 2's classics assets from the ground up, and it enjoyed great success. Estimates suggest that it sold around 435,000 copies in its first week, which meant that it's believed to have outsold the lifetime sales of the PlayStation 2 original in just 7 days. So in short, it saw critical and commercial success. People loved it. I loved it. For me, it was a fantastic way to experience a PlayStation 2 classic that is some people's favourite game of all time, that I missed first time around and I was never ever going to go back and play. So yeah, it let me fill in a gap in my sort of gaming culture, if you like, that I otherwise wouldn't have. And I think from what I can see, this is the earliest example I've found of something like this being really done in the modern era. I should also throw out an honourable mention to Ratchet & Clank from 2016, although that was more of a reboot to sort of tie the first game in with the movie that was coming out at the time than an actual remake. But I think it definitely did contribute, so yeah, wanted to give it an honourable mention. In my opinion, it was through Shadow and Ratchet to an extent, as I said before, that developers and publishers realised there was a real market for re-releases of games with a little bit more effort put into them than just an HD upres, and also that players would be a lot more accepting of that from a moral standpoint as well. Hence, the industry focus shifted more towards the Shadow of Colossus remake style of re-release and away from the quick, here's a HD reskin collection side of things. But that's not all. On top of this, I think the mentality of the player actually has changed since around 2015 to where we are now. And I think this speaks to why there is a market for games like Shadow of Colossus Remake. I think generally speaking, as an industry, we're a lot more mindful of preservation now than we were, say, around 2015. And by preservation, I don't just mean ensuring that, say, physical copies of games survive. By preservation, I mean ensuring that games from our past are easily accessible to future generations without having to jump through hoops like buying expensive old hardware that nobody really has and things like that. In simple terms, people like me who grew up on the original PlayStation and the PlayStation 2, we're getting older, we're buying houses, we're having kids, and we want our kids to experience the joy of beating a prostitute over the head with a baseball bat in Grand Theft Auto, just like we did as perfectly well-adjusted 10-year-olds. More than that though, I think as we get older, we're also starting to want to return to our roots ourselves and go back and play some of our old favourites from our childhood and relive those experiences. And I think as we try and do that, we're coming to one of two stark realisations. One, either that there's no reasonable way for us to go back and actually play whatever X favourite game of ours from our childhood is, because it's not out on modern platforms, and it's not on sale anywhere easily either, so you just simply can't get it without going out and buying old hardware and finding an old physical copy of the game. Or, number two, if we do find a way of going back and playing whatever old game it is, whether that's through emulation or through some form of backwards compatibility, we find that the experience we're getting is far from the joyous experience we remember through the rose-tinted lens of nostalgia. To give some examples to maybe make this make a little bit more sense, I recently went back and tried to play some of the favourites that I had from my childhood, and those were the original Just Cause and Grand Theft Auto 3 and Grand Theft Auto Vice City. So my first logical step in this process was I booted up Steam, seen all those games were on sale on Steam for fucking peanuts basically, I bought them. But then I fired them up on my PC, which has got a nice 3070 in it, and I was just plagued with a fucking myriad of graphical issues. You see, 3D games from that time are just not built for our modern screens. They were built for small, low-res, shitty CRT televisions. They're not built for the fucking 50-inch 4K telly that I have on my desk. They just look terrible, and in a lot of cases the physics of the games and stuff don't work properly, because back in those days it was quite common for developers to tie the physics of the game to the frame rate of said old shitty CRT telly. So they just don't work very well and they look horrible. I remember Just Cause seemed to particularly struggle to find a resolution that actually works on my TV screen, and in Grand Theft Auto 3 there was this like weird ghost effect that sort of felt like you were seeing double of a lot of things in the game. So the important thing to take away from that is, although all those games were still on sale and easily purchasable in 2021, they weren't actually playable in any reasonable fashion. So in the case of GTA, those two GTA games, GTA 3 and GTA Vice City, as I said, this wasn't the end of my journey, because I noticed that they were on PS4 and they were on sale on PS4, so I fucking picked them up there and thought, let's give this a try. And even though all the sort of graphical glitches had largely been ironed out for these console versions, the game's still controlled horribly. The button schemes are all different from what modern conventions have become, and there's no way to actually remap buttons, and things that we take for granted in modern games, like just a manually controllable third-person camera, just didn't exist back then. So the end result, again, was that these games felt basically unplayable to me. Now, I appreciate that that's something of a subjective point, and that different people are going to have different tolerances for that sort of thing, but I stand by the overall statement. As aging gamers, we're experiencing the nostalgia-driven desire to revisit our past, and the results, for the reasons I explained previously, are largely disappointing. Therefore, there's an increased desire to see our favourite games from our childhood remade and modernised in a way that we can actually relive those experiences again. Whereas I think in the early 2010s and around 2015, we maybe hadn't quite reached the age yet where that nostalgia for the good old days, quote unquote, was pinging us. So I think we just needed those years to pass and to age just a little bit. The last thing I just wanted to throw out there is that I also think it's partly to do with the state of the industry from a technological standpoint. Now, back in the early 2010s, 2015, we were going from PS3 to PS4. PS3 was quite long in the tooth by the time that generation ended, and obviously it had been a massive technological leap from PlayStation to PlayStation 2 to PlayStation 3. So I think there was a lot more focus on what was going to be next, what the next technological leap was going to be, so people were less interested in old games. Whereas now, the industry technologically has become a lot more iterative. We're seeing less and less distance in the steps that are taken between console generations, and these half console generations being announced now as well. So I think there's less overall excitement about what the next thing is going to be able to do, because the chances are what the next thing is going to be able to do is going to be very, very fucking similar to what the thing you have just now can currently do. It's just maybe going to look slightly prettier and run at a slightly higher frame rate. And I think that's freed up a lot more of our focus to go back and start thinking about old games again, compared to the 2010s, as I say, when I think we were a lot more forward focused.